Okay, this is an auto-battler roguelite that I was sent a key for during early access, and I ended up liking the in-game progression system even if the meta progression is a little hit or miss. And I'm enjoying playing it in general, as you can probably tell by the Let's Play channel. But before we dive into the weeds of dissecting the game, I want to do a quick sanity check on myself. Basically, am I crazy, or does Time Walker Dark World feel like the game name equivalent of Tom Scott, where it's just two first names slammed together? But regardless of weird naming conventions, we have a game to cover. And getting the big gripe out of the way first, as you can tell by the title, the translation will be a little rough, and it was to the point where I had a hard time parsing the intent of the story, which roughly seems to be our characters stuck in a time loop fighting bosses that are absorbing our world, and we're just continually fighting them off loop after loop as we climb the difficulty tiers. I'm sure it makes a bit more sense in its original language, but with the full English translation in 1.0, that's about all I could glean from it, and there are a few other areas where the language barrier of the translation can be a bit of a pain, especially with more complex skills, which can sometimes be a bit confusing as to whether something is good or bad. That said, the simpler skills are easy enough to parse, and the complex ones are spread out enough that you can figure them out by trial and error pretty quickly. And about 20 hours in, I've unlocked a decent chunk and have been able to get all the way to the final boss a few times, even if I have yet to actually beat them, since, well, the last zone in Hell difficulty lives up to its name, and I think I will need to unlock a few more advanced classes and upgrades to really get my way through it. The rest of the difficulties, though, are fairly straightforward to run to completion. That said, I do wish that the progression would be possible on any difficulty, but the way it's designed is that easy difficulty only lets you fight the first zone, normal has you fighting the first and second, and then as it progresses up, you ultimately reach Hell difficulty, which has you fighting through 5 of the 6 zones in the game, and you have to beat every previous difficulty to reach the next one. Now, you might be asking, what about that 6th zone? Well, that's a bit of an oddity. This is because the 3rd zone is a coin flip for which direction it takes you, whether it's the snowy mountains or the slime-filled lava pits. So you'll never get both in one run, but you will generally experience both before beating the game further down the road, much less unlocking all of the achievements, which involves beating Hell difficulty multiple times. So far, this may sound like a standard indie auto-battler, outside of maybe the fact that it's single-player instead of PvP. And to an extent, you're right, but what engages me with it is actually the way it designs its progression in-game, which uses an interesting mix of class and skill systems that make it so that while you can plan out builds, you do still have to be adaptable on each run, or you'll end up underpowered for the upcoming challenges. Starting with the class system, this is something you pick as soon as you start a run, by basically selecting the available pool of characters that you can spawn as you play through the round. Though these are far from the only characters. This is because the game relies on a card merging system to upgrade items or create new ones, so you have upgrades here as well. The most straightforward are going to be your direct upgrades that basically allow you to turn 3 cards for a basic class into an advanced version of that class that's just better in most ways, such as turning the fighter into the veteran or the priest into the apostle, usually with an upgraded attack effect compared to the original version, better base stats, etc. When you also have the hybrid upgrades, an early one being priest plus fighter, which gives you the Holy Knight, that not only has better stats but counts towards the group bonus as both a priest and a fighter in addition to its other bonuses. This makes the hybrids especially interesting even if there's only a few of them when you want to double up on another class in your run, rather than running all 4 characters on different classes. And yes, class combinations give your party a global boost that you definitely want to consider. You can view them by hovering over the various icons at the top of the screen, with things such as attack speed, passive healing, damage, or defense upgrades, etc. being common. Though you have to experiment to find out what combos do what in the long run, since there's no out-of-the-round indicators as to what these specifically are. Now, your character's abilities work in a similar format, except they have tiers instead of just straight combos. So what you'll do over the course of a run is hunt for 3 copies of a skill at a level and then combine them to make the next highest level version of that skill. So 3 level 1 into a level 2 and 3 level 2 into a level 3. Kind of standard for the genre, but with 12 slots to fill and a limited sized backpack, it can make for some interesting decisions, especially with how skills interact. To take this a bit further, there's also skills called EX skills, basically the skill equivalent of the combo classes. And they generally combine the functions of two skills into one slot, resulting in letting you have even more abilities to play with and making your characters more potent in general. This is especially useful when going for hell difficulty, since it gives you so much more just to mess with and gives you a leg up by basically giving you an extra skill slot to overcome the challenges that come at you. This is especially pertinent since in the final zone, the enemies are basically characters just like yours, though without the X skills and such. So you will be fighting enemies that are able to actually match your potency, which is something the enemies in previous zones couldn't quite do if you just got a good mix of tier 3 skills for all of your characters. The levels also play with formations to increase the difficulty further, which is something I haven't seen in too many places for this genre, since even in PvP games of this type, it's usually you positioning on one side of the field against an opponent that has a mirrored space. For this, the first two zones are pretty much like you'd expect, you on the left, enemy on the right, but starting at the third zone, you get a curveball by being flanked in most of the encounters, or with split deployment locations. The fourth zone pushes you to being surrounded on all four sides, and then the fifth zone is just utter chaos doing all of the above. This means that going all squishy DPS doesn't work too well, since these angles of attack will end up with them getting popped before being able to kill stuff. So you'd think you'd want to go all tanks, but no, that actually works against you even more, since every combat has a timer, adjusted by meta progression a little bit, but that usually starts around a minute long. If all of your characters die in an encounter before the timer's up, you use your reincarnation slots to get them back and move on. Basically, you escape. But if you run out of time in a battle, it's game over, and you have to start over from scratch. So basically, balancing the offense and defense of your party is something to consider, and something you can get a lot of boons for or bad RNG blocking it, because the third type of card you get are books. These are given to you each of the gold portal levels, which unlike the blue, which are normal encounters, purple, which are elite encounters that give class cards, and red, which are boss encounters, gold has no enemies, instead giving you a stat-boosting book that is consumable, that can be used on one character and one character only, and a skill card unless you get a world event that changes it. These books provide a permanent buff to life, defense, or attack, so if you're going hyper-offensive and only get life boosts, you might hate it, but if you get a ton of defense boosts, you could end up with a super tank that just never dies for better or worse. Personally, I prefer getting a nice mix, and hopefully a few world events that give me some spares, so I can focus my characters into their specific roles a little bit easier. That, combined with the standard combat effects like chill, stun, burn, etc., and spellcasting, is pretty much what the core gameplay loop is made of. It's simple enough to be approachable, but offers enough depth that you can actually consider strategies at higher difficulties, which is a nice balance a lot of games fail at because they either become too crunchy to be approachable without doing a dissertation on them, or too simple and you find up just an overpowered combo and beat every difficulty in a heartbeat. And while I would like some in-battle live interactions by the player, with how short the fights are, this is not as big of a concern as it is in other auto-battlers, at least ones I've looked at recently. Though it would be something for the team behind this to consider if they end up making a follow-up title, since trigger events can bring a lot more player activity to a game like this. Now, the actual gameplay is what makes this title cathartic to me, because I love theory crafting builds, but unfortunately the meta progression cools that enjoyment a little bit. This is because, at least to me, it feels a bit convoluted being split between two systems. One being an achievement system, the other being an orb system. And while they mostly stay in their own lanes with achievements unlocking upgrade classes and orbs unlocking new base classes, spells, etc., there are a few class upgrades that only unlock through the orbs, and even one upgrade class that I honestly don't even know how I unlocked it. It was just there when I got the bases for it. But overall, the meta progression isn't bad, it just makes it weird to plan out how you want to go about unlocking specific things, since some can be unlocked with the orbs you earn by playing, while others require you to jump through some hoops to achieve specific challenges on the two higher difficulties, and needless to say, there are some decent hoops since it's hard to get anything other than the Sorceress and the Archer to get MVP achievements for any run that they're in, since they scale so quickly on damage and you can even get high healing on them, even when not terribly focused on it. While your melee classes are a bit more of a slow burn, have to walk up to enemies, etc., and don't quite get there unless you build specifically around them and avoid over-amping your two ranged classes. Now, once you have all of it unlocked, there are a ton of fun combos to mess around with in terms of party composition, especially since some of the upgrades you get have you start with specific books, classes, and spells, and you can build around that to improve your setup diversity. So for me, this is pretty much all I want for a lunch break game, so it's an absolute recommend in that regard, and since it's about the price of a decent fast food burger, it fits that slot quite well. So no, it's not a masterpiece, but if you're looking for something to burn some time at lunch or while messing around on a laptop while cooking dinner, it's a great game for filling that gap, since it's nowhere near as demanding on your time as an RPG, while not quite being as basic as some of those match 3 games.